And if you talk to anybody in Eastern Europe, especially, it's very real to all of them. And so what this tells me is that the atmosphere is very, very much like 1983. Very heightened tension, very much war is very much present on the minds of everybody who lives near the battlefield. I mean, you don't have to talk to people from Eastern Europe to get that. You talk to people from Europe in general, and they'll tell you that, yeah, the Russian war is right there. I mean, for me, the equivalent when I was in Germany last year, I had to think about the equivalent would be like if Montana was being invaded by the Russians and I'm in Oregon. Like that's how close it is, right? So it's very present to them. Um, and then you factor in other developments we've seen recently. So we've got so with Steadfast Defender underway, we're seeing kind of a mirroring of Able Archer 83 with the large NATO exercise taking place at a time of heightened tension. But what we don't have is a Gorbachev. And honestly, we don't even have a Reagan. I mean, I don't think Joe Biden wants war, but I also don't think Joe Biden is that talented of an orator and capable of wooing public opinion both here and abroad in the ways that he needs. And we certainly don't have a Gorbachev character in Vladimir Putin. We have the opposite, right? We have what would have happened if the hardliners had taken over in 1984. And that's very scary and dangerous because Russia is launching a major offensive right now against the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv. And as it stands, it looks like Ukraine might be able to hold the line against that. But any contingencies that develop will significantly strain Ukrainian resources. That is to say, a large Russian push against a city like Sumy or Chernihiv, or against, God forbid, Kyiv, that would trigger potentially a disaster for the Ukrainians. And so the only way to stave off that disaster is to make good on the promise that the French made about a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, to militarily defend Lviv and Kyiv from a ground invasion. So that is to say, if France were to deploy its forces to defend Lviv and Kyiv, the Ukrainians could redeploy their forces from Western Ukraine to Eastern Ukraine, and potentially hold the line and take back territory. But that's what we're facing right now, is that short of a NATO intervention or a NATO state intervention, not necessarily a NATO alliance intervention, short of a Western European state intervening militarily to at least bolster Ukraine, Ukraine might start taking some serious losses in the near future. And it's alarming because they don't really have that many people to spare. They don't have that much equipment to spare, and especially ammunition. Despite the fact that U.S. aid is now flowing, the delay is cost thousands of Ukrainian lives and miles and miles of territory. And so we have that tension in the air as well. So as the NATO exercise comes to an end in June, we'll be probably seeing the culmination of the Russian offensive against Ukraine. So that's going to be a very tense time as well for that reason. The problem that we're seeing is the KGB mindset tells Putin that we're already at war, that the West is already at war. When the Russian state says, America, stay out of Georgia, we're watching those protests closely, they're not just saying it like some tankies on the internet say it because they want to get their snaps and their rah-rahs and make dad mad. They're saying it because a lot of times they genuinely believe it, right? You have to listen to what they're saying. And if they're saying, and they have been saying for years, that the West is trying to attack the Russians and that there's NATO conscripts on the ground now in Ukraine and blah, 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 we have to take that at face value because we have to understand that's what the Russian people believe. And Putin is a man of the people. He's a populist. And so that sums up why I've had so much trouble lately not shitting my pants. But yeah, just you have to think about all the things that we're missing now that we had in 1983. And the fact that the doomsday clock today is at 90 seconds to midnight. Okay, let's say the North Koreans fire a missile with a nuclear warhead and it's going out over the Pacific to detonate in a test, but the U.S. has said they won't let that happen. We'll shoot it down. Well, depending on where that missile is and when we detect it, we might have to use a mid-course interceptor, which those are based in Alaska, and it takes 3 or 4 of them to knock down one missile, to be sure. They are about the size of an ICBM. And so when they get launched, the Russians will see that. They won't see the North Korean launch because their radars don't point south, they point north. So they'll just see 4 ICBMs coming over the horizon. Now, normally I'd say somebody at NORAD will get on the phone with the Russians. I'm sure they've got a officer on speed dial, but who knows these days? I mean, I'm sure they do, but who knows how they would interpret that data these days? If they would believe it. We just don't know. And it's a very tense situation. Now, I'm not saying that a war escalation is likely. I'm saying that it's not outside the realm of possibility. And that shouldn't be the case. This is the closest we've been to nuclear war, I think, since 1983, and I think in the next couple months since the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's frightening. It really is. Like it could spiral rapidly when it does. NATO wouldn't chain automatically. It doesn't work quite like that. I mean, it depends on what happens. If French forces were in Ukraine and they got attacked by Russian forces, NATO would have a discussion, they would debate, they would vote, they would probably come to France's aid. But until that happened, independent states within NATO are free to do whatever the hell they want. They just can't do it under the guises of the alliance, right? They don't have all the alliance structure with that.
Would Putin make that distinction?
No, he would not. He would not, at all. But what I'm trying to say is that, at least on our side, we wouldn't necessarily see an automatic chaining unless something like the Polish mainland came under attack, or a NATO member came under direct attack. Then obviously the alliance would chain pretty quickly. I mean, they would still have to vote. It's not an automatic process, but that's the idea of these multinational battle groups, is that if Estonia gets invaded, well, they have to go through a couple hundred American soldiers first, and it's a lot easier to sell the American public on defending Estonia if a bunch of Americans have already bled for it. So, yeah.
I guess I'm just wondering why Putin would be... Which Western leader is going to start this war? I mean, if he's really that paranoid, which of our various schmucks is actually going to start a war? Who's he worried about?
I couldn't answer that one. I don't know if it's so much one person. He's not necessarily he's not really afraid of NATO invading Russia to take territory. He's more afraid of the ideas that NATO stands for taking hold in territories close to Russia and then within Russia. And so he knows that nobody within NATO wants this war, and I think he plays on that because he sees it. It gives him a position of strength. He knows that NATO will back down unless a certain red line is crossed, and so he's constantly testing the waters. Right? He's constantly pushing the envelope. Okay, well, if that's the red line, what about this? What, this is like right up to the line. I'm not touching you. I'm not touching you. I'm not touching you. Right?
Well, going off of that, wouldn't it make more sense than, unless something pretty dramatic happens, for, say, Moldova or more of Georgia to be next?
Yeah, I mean, it's entirely possible. And the problem with Moldova is Russia doesn't really have the military means to do much there. I mean, they've got forces in Moldova, but Moldova and Romania with Ukrainian help could handle that situation. And the Russians can't really land more forces because the Ukrainians have this annoying habit of sinking all their landing ships. So, and their support ships and their warships. So, that can't happen. Georgia, of course, could be a flashpoint. And that's one that I'm watching very closely, especially in light of the recent protests. There was the parliament passed a bill akin to bills passed in a lot of the other former Soviet states that basically said that any organizing group or political action group within the country that receives outside aid must register as a foreign agent. And so that's a good way to kill democratic movements, even if they are totally non-nefarious, supported by outsiders. Okay, we bought them a printing press. That's not nefarious, but it's an American printing press. Maybe it was a CIA printing press. What does that mean, right? So the Georgian people took to the streets in the hundreds of thousands in the last couple of weeks to protest this bill. And it got passed anyway, so the president vetoed it. And I'm not a scholar on Georgian politics, so I don't know where it goes from here. But it's something to watch because it could end up looking like Euromaidan in Ukraine in 2014, which is how we got to the present situation. Kazakhstan has made a lot of moves toward the West in recent months. They've been sending limited aid to Ukraine, mostly medical aid, but still significant from what is supposed to be Russia's biggest and strongest ally in Central Asia. Armenia is no longer really on talking terms militarily with Russia. The Russians are pulling out almost entirely, and so that's the situation to be watching too, because Armenia could break away from the Russian periphery, and it looks like Armenia has been making military agreements with a lot of NATO states, small states like Lithuania, but also larger states like France. And so that's something to watch. There's a lot in motion right now. To sum it up, there's a lot in motion, and when things are in motion, it's like a tectonic plate. When the tectonic plate moves a lot, there's an earthquake. There's a lot of friction. So let's just hope that friction doesn't start something bigger.
War never changes.
That's all for this teaser. Angry Planet listeners, if you want to hear the rest of that, go to angryplanetpod.com. Sign up, $9 a month, get you access to bonus episodes, as well as some written work that's coming down the pipe. Again, that's at angryplanetpod.com. So if you want to know the whole spread of his thinking and kind of be really, really paranoid going into June, if you want to hear more about nuclear weapons, if you want to know what it tastes like when Russia makes its own Coca-Cola, angryplanetpod.com. You get bonus episodes, you get written stuff, and you get commercial-free versions of the mainline episodes. You should get an email that tells you how to set all of that up when you sign up. Again, that's at angryplanetpod.com. We will be back a little bit later with another conversation about conflict on an angry planet. Stay safe until then.